Hello everybody, what's up? It's Thursday, November the 7th, Macro Talk 2. Great to see everybody here, good crowd as always. I've got a lot to talk about today. We're going to be talking about microscopes. And I'm going to give a warning, I'm not a microscope expert or anything like that. I'm going to be talking about microscopes from the very superficial level of what use they might possibly be to us as photographers. And I think it's pretty interesting. We've got quite a bit to talk about, but that will be in just a second. First of all, a follow-up from the other day. I left out something really important when I was talking about public surplus auctions. And I want to touch on that just briefly so that I can be more complete. Thanks to George for pointing this out. I never discussed any of the fees that are associated with these purchases, and I should have done, because you can oftentimes get real bargains, as I talked about, but there is almost always a set of fees that go with it. There is a thing called a buyer's premium. I have no idea what it is. It's just an additional fee, sometimes as high as 20%, that you pay on the final price that you get for the item. There are usually taxes and some other fees associated with it. It can add up to maybe as high as 20%, sometimes a good bit less. But on my microscope, for example, I ended up winning it for about $180, which is not bad for an $8,000 microscope, but I paid another $30-something in fees and taxes. And that's worth knowing. Another thing is, I may have touched on this, but you usually have to go pick up your winnings. You don't get them to ship it to you. That's not part of the deal. You can get companies to do that for you. There are companies that will go in, they'll pick it up, they'll wrap it, they'll ship it to you, and they'll charge you an arm and a leg. It can be hundreds of dollars. So if you're not planning on actually picking it up, then that's a problem. I actually have a list of cities in which I know people who have said they would go pick up a thing if I won it, if it wasn't too big, and so on. And I also have my son who travels around a bit, and I know where he goes, and so he could possibly do it. I've never had to call on them, but that's another way that you can do it, is to get a friend to pick up on it. So thank you, George. George, I was going to show the picture of your flash setup, and I cannot find the picture. If you could, well, I'll tell you what, I'll find it and show it on Tuesday. It's brilliant, and I will show it. Let me see. A word about interpretations, which isn't going to mean anything to you unless you're a Patreon supporter. But if you are, this is a project that I started, and I'm going to put a pause on it until we talk on Saturday, because I'm just not sure I have the right formula for it yet. So if you're looking for the pictures for this Saturday, you won't find them because I didn't post them. But I'll talk to you about it on Saturday. The competition results are out. The video was released. I just showed the cover of it at the beginning here. And congratulations to Klaus for another astonishing photograph, and to all the winners, and in fact to everybody who entered. It was a wonderfully entertaining episode. I thoroughly enjoyed the pictures, and so did my guest judge, Lonnie Stewart, who was very, very impressed. I've already had a discussion with Klaus about this, and I think, I'll tell you what, I'm going to hold that discussion till later too, because he gave me a great idea for a video, and we'll talk about it later. Okay, let me see. The November and December competition is now underway. It's a 2-month long competition. You're allowed to submit 3 photographs, whether you've won in the past or not. And we have a guest judge, maybe 2 guest judges, but certainly one, Lester Lefkowitz. And we have several now prizes. I asked if anybody had any gear that they wanted to donate, good stuff that's in good shape that they don't need anymore. And right out of the gate, Paul Mayshak has donated a really nice tripod head. One of the locking Z-type tripod heads, a really nice one. So we have another prize. That's in addition to the color calibration system that we're going to be giving away, and also the signed Lester Lefkowitz books. So it's going to be the biggest competition we've ever done, and I am really, really excited about it. I cannot wait to see what you guys turn in. Okay, microscopes. Who am I talking to, and what is the purpose of this session? Well, it occurred to me that we talk about microscopes quite a lot. We talk about microscope objectives, and we talk about the microscopes themselves. Yet, for many of you who are macro photographers, especially if you do mostly field macro photography, you may feel that a lot of this discussion is irrelevant to you, or just not interesting, because you don't really know what we're talking about. So I thought I'd take a step back and give you a general overview of different types of microscopes, how they're normally used, what they're used for, and what we might use them for. I now have two microscopes, and they're both very different types for different purposes. And I'll explain that, and I'm not trying to give you a detailed... This is kind of like doing a 50-minute talk on cars. There are only certain things you'll be able to cover in a discussion about cars, and it's the same with microscopes. If you want to know everything about microscopes, there are loads of resources. Probably the best and most approachable one is Rick's site, the PMN, photomacrography.net, where they have a whole community of microscopists who talk about microscopes at length and in detail that is way beyond me. So I'm going to be giving you this from the perspective of an interested macro photographer, and I am fascinated by it, which is why it comes up from time to time. But there are generally, for the sake of this conversation, there are five types of microscopes I'm going to talk about, and I'll contrast them and go through them each. The first one is the stereo microscope, also called dissecting microscopes, and they're the kind of microscopes that we buy for insect prep and things like that, and I'll talk about them in just a second. The second type is the compound microscope. That's the type of microscope that you see in a research lab or in a hospital laboratory. Then we'll talk about digital microscopes, which are a separate category and kind of interesting in and of themselves. And then I'll touch briefly on a couple of different types of electron microscope. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because I have a project I'm working on that involves electron microscopes. So we may have time to talk about that too. So the most basic microscope, well, it's really not the most basic. The most basic is a kid's compound microscope, which was the first one I had when I was 10, I think, which actually is not a bad tool for looking at things close up. You know, there's one thing I forgot to show you, and I will be so mad at myself if I don't. I want to thank Susan for donating a couple of pieces of equipment that she wasn't using, but that have proved to be incredibly useful in the studio, and you're going to be seeing a lot more of them. These two things are BrioCam number 1 and BrioCam number 2, or both BrioCams at the same time. This is amazing, and it's going to be so useful if I want to show you how my equipment is set up, or if I want to show you something up close. Now we've got a way to do it. And I couldn't believe the things are this clear and this bright, and I think they're fantastic, don't you? It's very exciting. So I just wanted to show you that, so you'll know. I can put these cameras anywhere, and I'll be using them over on the camera platform and with the microscope and everything else, so you can really see up close what we're getting into. Okay, The stereo microscope. There's one behind me, right there. It's a Leica. The purpose of the stereo microscope is to give you an up close look at stuff that you are interacting with. It allows you to see the subject in stereo because you have two light paths, one for each eye. So you're looking at that. Well, it's complicated how it actually works, but you do get a sense of depth of the subject. I use it to prep insects, to examine things I'm going to photograph, to clean insects, to really anything that I would normally have used a magnifying glass for in the past, I can use this for. Now, the range of magnification of a microscope like this is fairly limited, and it's mostly low power. These are not the kind of microscopes you'd normally think about as a photographic tool. Let me step back and say that whatever microscope you're talking about, in the context of something that a photographer would have in his studio, is either going to be a tool that you use to assist your macro photography, or it could be actually a camera system that you use to take the final picture. And I separate the two. I seldom ever take pictures through the stereoscope. I shoot a lot of video through it, but I seldom take pictures. It's not the best platform to take a high resolution photograph. Compound microscopes are a bit different. They are usually higher power, but equipped correctly, they can act more like a camera. And then in the middle is this weird setup we use in macro photography, where we have basically an infinity conjugate microscope setup that we have turned into a camera lens, and it's really a compound microscope, but the way we use it, it acts more like a camera. So when we talk about microscopes, some of them are used as the end result of a photographic tool to take the final picture. Others are used to prepare them, and I'll give you some examples of that as we go through. These dissecting microscopes usually go from about 5 times magnification up to about 100 times, seldom more than that, and they're not very useful at high magnification because you don't have much of a field of view, and if you're trying to work on it, it's hard to find where your instruments are. So it's usually for looking at larger subjects, plants, insects, for getting an overall view, great for cleaning, great for posing and positioning them. They have limited application as photographic tools, incredibly useful as subject preparation tools. You can buy a new one for $500 to a couple of $1,000. Now we're talking about a mid-range group of microscopes. You can spend a lot more, and you can actually spend a lot less for some pretty rubbishy ones. The first one I got was about $100. So you can do that. On the used market, you can get used Amscope scopes, which aren't very good, to be honest, for next to nothing. A good scope, a good imported scope, something like my Leica, which is absolutely optically, I think, the best I've ever seen, that will set you back a couple of $1,000. More if you have a big heavy stand with it, and less if it's just the body. So that's the kind of range and the magnification you can expect. I think every serious macro photographer probably should have one of these, just for getting your specimens perfectly presentable for photography, especially if you're doing it at high magnification. If you're a field macro photographer, maybe less so. But if you do a lot of work in the studio, I think you probably need one of these at some point. One thing you might not need but might want, and for some subjects you would need, would be a compound microscope. This is the kind of microscope you'd see in a research lab or in a hospital, and they are also come in a huge range. and the range is usually related to the quality of the build as well as the features that the microscope offers. Generally speaking, a compound microscope will give you magnifications anywhere from 40 to about 1,000. Now, understand I'm giving you just general ballpark stuff here. Don't say, no, my compound microscope goes down to 38x and up to 1,003. I get it. There are definitely optical microscopes that can go a little higher, but the limitation here is the optics, and the majority of good quality microscopes are going to go up to about 1,000, and that's usually with 100 times objective and eyepieces that give you the rest. These compound microscopes are typically these days they're infinity corrected, meaning they have a variable distance that can go between the tube lens and the objective lens, allowing you to do other things. Add axial light, for example, light that travels along the same beam you're viewing. Most of these microscopes are using transmissive light. They're using light that's coming up from below, or in the case of my microscope, coming from above, my new microscope, but the light is passing through a thin layer of the subject, and you are looking at the light that is coming through after being interfered with by the thin subject, which is often on a slide and covered with a cover slip. For that reason, a lot of microscopes use a very short working distance. Now, again, there are many exceptions to this. My inverted scope, which everything is upside down, has a long working distance because of what it's used for, which is for looking at tissue cultures. But these microscopes, like I say, normally have a magnification range of 40 to 1,000. And that is because they're most often used for looking at biological specimens as well as metallurgic specimens. They're used in industry. They're used to examine products like circuit boards, things like that. They often can be adapted for use as a camera, but most of the time, I would say the majority of the time, the camera is there to document what the microscopist is seeing through the microscope. In other words, it is not designed to be the camera. It is incidentally a camera as well as an observation tool, but mostly it's used like that. Now, there are, again, exceptions for living organisms, for example, with a scope like mine, which is inverted. It's perfect for that. For looking at pond scum or diatoms is another thing. For looking at things suspended in liquids, you can do that with these scopes. But very often what you're looking at is a prepared slide with a cover slip. And at high magnifications, the light, the objective is pretty much touching, or in some cases actually is touching an intermediate substance between the objective and the slide. Oil is usually used, but water can be used too. So there is no space to speak of between the objective and the subject. That's necessary because of the way these things work. But there are ways that you can use different kinds of lighting, oblique lighting and external lighting, to get some reflective component into the image that you're looking at as well. These microscopes, depending on a million different factors, can be enormously expensive. On a new microscope, very basic light field or dark field microscope, we'll talk about those differences in just a second, but a scope that you would use as a tool that doesn't have anything fancy on it, just a light source, a condenser to process the light for transmission, and then a stage to put the subject on, an objective or possibly 2 or 3 objectives at different powers, a tube lens in the system, and then a pair of eyepieces for you to look through, maybe a third turret to put a camera on. That's the basic features, and something like that will cost you from $1,000 to $3,500 for a middle-of-the-road one. You can spend $100,000 on a light microscope. They're not light either. They're very heavy, but they, light is what they're using to image the subject. Add things like DIC that you may have heard of. Photographers love that. It's differential interference contrast. It's a way the light is split into different parts by prisms and then recombined in the final image that creates beautiful depth and contour for things that normally would be flat and translucent. Phase contrast microscopes are more expensive. Mine is a phase contrast scope. And there are so many different things that you can add. Camera systems, video, different kinds of light. And they're all expensive. Now, it's worth mentioning that if you look at used microscopes in auctions, for example, which is where you may be looking, it's a good place to look if you're going to buy one, you'll often find really, really high-end research microscopes that have motorized everything. They have motorized focus, motorized positioning systems for the subject, and they are incredibly expensive, but they're also terrible for people like us who are using them to observe small things and maybe photograph them. These devices are used for counting cells and other things that we just wouldn't use them for, and they're a huge liability because if your motorized platform breaks down, you don't have a way to move your specimen, that type of stuff. So generally I say look for the high quality microscopes, brands like Leica, Nikon, Olympus, Zeiss. They all make ranges of microscopes, and even their basic microscopes are very good. I mentioned that most microscopes these days are infinity conjugate and describe the different lenses, but that's not true of all of them. Older microscopes are not infinity conjugate. They don't use infinity corrected microscope objectives. One of the features, by the way, of those objectives is that they're very expensive, but they have all of the corrections for aberrations, chromatic aberrations in them, as opposed to older microscopes which just have an objective, an empty tube, and an eyepiece. In those older microscopes, very often a lot of the correction is done in the eyepiece, which kind of limits you to interchangeability, and you have to have the objective at the right distance in order to use it as a microscope and get the best possible image. Microscope objectives. Many of you have the wonderful $16 or $26 4x finite objective. That's from an older microscope, but it makes a lovely camera lens if you get it on the right kind of tube length. But microscope objectives can cost $10,000. They can. If they're corrected for all wavelengths of visible light, like the apochromatic objectives that Mitutoyo makes, for example, if they have an extra long working distance, meaning loads of room between the objective and the subject, so you can get light in there, and you can do creative lighting to show your subjects, boy, these can get terribly, terribly expensive. So you need to think about that. If you're buying a microscope used, you absolutely need to think about eyepieces, camera adapters, and objectives, because oftentimes they'll be sold without those things. And if you don't have those things, you'll have to buy them. And going out to buy individual objectives will probably cost you more than buying the microscope did. Just briefly, because they're not really of much interest, I think, to us in what we do, are digital microscopes. You've seen them. They all look about the same. A little grey tube or black tube that has a lens on one end and a USB plug-in on the other. They're not bad. They're not bad for looking at things if you just want to look every now and again at something very small. They they'll put a picture directly on your computer screen. The cheaper ones are awful. They're full of all kinds of optical aberrations. They oftentimes have a long lag between imaging and showing you the picture on the computer. They're not very useful. I tried using them for several years, every now and again, for insect prep, so that I could do it and you could see what I was doing, and they were just pretty awful. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't digital microscopes that are absolutely fantastic. We talked about one system from Keon's, I believe, and there are many others, but they make a really high-end research digital microscope that costs, the $90,000 or something like that for their base model. So they do make fancy ones, but I'm not really talking about them. Let's talk for a minute. By the way, those digital scopes cost anywhere from $30 to $1,000, and they're all over the place. It depends what you're buying. Something of great interest to me, I've been interested in these my whole life, and have had very, very limited exposure to either of them. But these are the electron microscopes, and there are many different flavors. But you probably will most commonly hear about scanning electron microscopes and transmission electron microscopes. And they're interesting to talk about, just to compare them to the microscopes that we're most likely to see. Scanning electron microscopes, which generate a beam of electrons that are focused through magnetic coils and strike a subject, create a backscatter or a reflection. It's not really a reflection, it's actually an interaction, and I'll explain it in a second. But it puts off electrons when the beam of electrons hits the subject, and it scans across the subject, spraying electrons everywhere, that you have sensors inside the camera that pick those up and generate an image from them. Scanning electron microscopes typically are used to look at the surface of subjects. They're very good at looking at the surface of conductive subjects, like metal subjects, and they'll do that beautifully and give you fantastic surface detail. They're used a lot in industry and metallurgy. Biology uses them too. The biologic specimens, though, which are usually not conductive, don't do as good a job because they don't interact with the electrons in the same way. So what we have to do is coat the subject in a very thin layer of material. They usually use gold or carbon, and they use a device called a sputtering chamber that puts a very thin layer of molecular gold over the subject, and then it's able to reflect the electrons. I keep saying reflect, that's not what it does. When the beam hits the subject, it actually interacts with the molecules on the surface of the subject, which then emit an electron of their own in response to being bombarded with an electron from above. It is those electrons that are being emitted by the subject that's being stimulated by the beam of electrons that the sensors pick up, and that's how they form the image. So the subject is put on a tiny little platform that can be moved in different directions so that you can change your position, and the coating is what reacts with the electron beam. Now, as you turn up the power on the electron microscope, you increase the voltage or increase the current, you get either increased energy in the electrons or increased penetration of the electrons into the subject. And when that happens, the subject will produce backscattered electrons, which can actually show you something about the deeper structure of what you're looking at. Also, they will emit X-rays. If the electron beam is powerful enough and penetrates deeply enough, it can put off a relatively small amount of relatively low power X-rays, which can also be picked up by sensors. That can tell you quite a bit about the molecular composition of what's inside your subject. You can actually use this to form a picture of what the material you're looking at is from an elemental standpoint because of the way the X-rays are put out. Generally speaking, these microscopes, scanning electron microscopes, give you a range of magnification from 20,000 up to 100,000 times. That's a lot of magnification. So it's looking at very, very fine surface detail, high resolution. Resolution's another matter. I won't get into it now, but it's incredibly interesting if you want to read about it, how you combine the right power setting with the right current to get the perfect resolution for a given specimen. These things are expensive. $75,000 to $200,000 for a very, very basic scanning electron microscope, up to many hundreds of thousands of dollars for a really good one with all of the different sensors in it. You need support equipment with one of these devices. You need something to sputter the coatings on the subjects. You need something to provide high vacuums, because all of this happens in a vacuum. You can't have air molecules bouncing around in an electron microscope because it will deflect the electrons and you'll end up with a horrible fuzzy picture. So they have to be evacuated completely. And you need lots and lots of power. The energy that is used to generate the stream of electrons is about 30,000 volts. It's a lot of electricity. And and then the focusing elements, they use a lot of energy too. In fact, more energy than the thing that's producing the electrons at the top. Anyway, that's the typical electron microscope that most people would talk about in biological circles. At the other end of the spectrum is the transmission electron microscope, which takes pictures from 50,000 times magnification up to 1,000,000 times. 1,000,000 times. So this transmission electron microscope is able to image structures of a single nanometer in size, like gold atoms. You can actually see atoms with these microscopes, and they work by a completely different mechanism. They actually fire a beam of electrons through the subject, and the subject has to be very, very thin, maybe 100 nanometers thick, in order to be imaged by one of these scopes. They're used for looking at the internal structures of cells or viruses, and looking at actual protein molecules, for example. There's really no application for us. The scopes are used in research. They're scientific tools. The bare minimum, it would be $250,000 maybe for a very, very basic one, up to many millions of dollars. And the used market. Well, these are something that we don't need to worry about it unless you have several $1,000,000 hanging around and a whole big facility to put it in. The price is a bit silly at this point. You do need a separate room for one of these. It needs to be on a vibration cancelling platform and all kinds of things. These things are amazing to see. They're gigantic, and I'll never probably see one. Hopefully that's not the case with the scanning electron microscope. I have a crazy plan that I'm working on to try to get access to one of these devices to do a series of videos for you guys. That's all I can tell you about it right now, but I am excited about it, and it is underway. So that's quite a range of magnifications. There's an interesting feature of microscopy is that there is something of a gap between the practical applications of visible light microscopy, which will give you imaging up to about 1,000 times, and where scanning electron microscopy picks up at about 20,000 times. So you've got a range in there where, there really isn't a good way to image at these intermediate magnifications. Never really thought much about that, but it's a real thing. Anyway, the microscope that I'm getting is it's a research microscope. It's an inverted microscope. I think I've shown you pictures of it. I probably have a picture handy that I can throw up on the screen. Let me see. It's a research microscope, but it's really made for a very specific purpose. It's made for hang on a sec, guys. I can't think and talk very well. Did you know that? Have you noticed that? I bet you have. Hang on, here it is. This is a decent photograph of it. It's a bit small, but hang on a sec. So the one I'm getting is a Nikon Diaphot, and it's made for a very specific purpose, and that is for viewing. There it is. For viewing a tissue culture, which is used in scientific laboratories and in hospitals too. It's upside down with the eyepieces here, but the light path comes up through the objective, which is below the stage, the subject here, the condenser here, and the light source up at the top. This is I didn't intend to get an inverting scope. It's just the best bargain I found, and it was the first auction that I won, but it's in full working order, so it should be very useful for the kinds of things I'm going to use it for. It's big and it's heavy, and most of the better ones are. And this was I think I mentioned this. I got it for a couple of $100. The objectives under here cost about $1,000 a piece, so I think I'm made out like a bandit on this one. But if you look and if you're persistent, you'll find bargains. But you have to do a lot of legwork to find them. What are the features you need to consider if you're looking at buying a microscope? You need to know what magnification range you need and what you're going to use it for. The stereo microscope, obviously, like we talked about, is useful up to about maybe up to 100 times. I think mine only goes to 40, and that is more magnification than I need. If you're going to be looking at, say, diatoms, you want to be able to put a much more powerful objective on. You want to get magnification up around 400, 600, something like that, to get really close look at the structure of these tiny things. So knowing what range of magnification you want is going to limit the kind of microscope that you're looking at. Working distance is certainly a very important feature when we're using the parts of a microscope as our camera lens system. You cannot use an oil immersion 100 times magnification microscope objective to take regular photographs, because the objective is basically touching the subject. There's no way to light it. So we want objectives that give you some standoff between the objective and the subject. So that will certainly have an impact if you're planning on using reflected light. Illumination is important. If you're planning on buying a microscope that you're going to use for observing biologic specimens, you can use, a powerful LED light source. For a stereo microscope, you need a not particularly powerful LED light source, because it's much easier to illuminate the subject. But with a compound scope, you need more light, and a very high quality LED light source is often needs to be part of the setup. If your microscope is going to be using some kind of light hungry special filtering like polarization or DIC that we talked about or phase contrast, you need a more powerful light source, and it's still considered the gold standard to use a 100-watt halogen bulb rather than an LED light source. LED lights can be a little unpredictable in terms of color, but that's less of an issue, I think, in microscopy. But certainly, I know a lot of people who have converted their microscopes over to LEDs, and that is certainly what Charlie Krebs did with his research microscope. Can't remember which one he has. It's a Nikon as well, but it's not an inverted scope, I don't think. I can't remember. It's a comparison scope. That's what it is, a metallurgic scope. But yeah, he switched his over to LED. You definitely need to make sure, if you're looking at a microscope, that you buy one that you can put a camera on. Not that you will necessarily be taking pictures through it, but you may be. I mean, I certainly will be on mine, but you need to have a way to mount the camera. It is a mistake that I have made myself to buy a microscope that the only way that you could image what you were looking at was by using an eyepiece adapter. And yeah, when you put an eyepiece adapter in the microscope to put a camera on, that doesn't leave anywhere for your eyeball to look through, so you can actually position it, that type of thing. My microscope, by the way, just showing off a little bit here, has two microscope ports. It has one on the front and one on the side, which I think is super nifty. I don't think you can use them both at the same time, or would even want to, but yeah, it's a thing. Didn't know there was such a thing. But and I love the fact that the microscope goes directly onto that second camera port, so it will sit here right underneath my chin, and I'll be able to use my right hand to fire the shutter. That'll be handy. But yeah, I'm hoping beyond hope that when I go pick this scope up today or tomorrow, that I'm not going to have to completely take it apart to clean it and grease it and all that, because I've never taken apart a research microscope. Well, never taken apart one that I subsequently then put back together and worked. So there's that. Finding a microscope that's sturdy and well made, you really can't go wrong with any of the major brands. Probably the most common brand and model that I see, and I know a lot of people have these, are the Olympus, what's the model number? Somebody help me out on this. Is it BH2 or CH2? It's the BH2. Very, very nice basic microscope with great everything. Solidly built, great focus mechanism, good lighting, nice optics, easy to use, easy to service and maintain. Similar is the lab microscopes that Nikon makes. And every brand has reasonably affordable microscopes. If you're buying a microscope new, which I really, really wouldn't recommend unless you're super rich, if you're buying one new, you're going to end up buying something like an Amscope or an Omax, which are imported Chinese microscopes. I think Omax is Chinese, but I know that the Amscope ones are. And yeah, they're inexpensive. They're not particularly good. They have a lot of minor things with them that just make them a bit cheaper. They're not as well made. They're not as accurate. They have a very basic focusing mechanism. I'm sure that there are expensive lines of Amscopes that give you more useful features, but certainly the entry level ones are not. But you can buy used Nikons and Olympus microscope Zeiss for reasonable amounts of money. Microscope Central is a good resource if you want to get an idea for what microscopes are selling for. especially that you should do that if you're planning on bidding on one in an auction. Find out what they cost. Microscope Central and several other outlets are very useful. You will spend having information about price is actually not very useful now as I think about it, because they are all over the shop. If you look at this microscope that I'm buying, you will find it priced from $300, usually with a note that says for parts only, doesn't work, missing eyepieces, missing objectives, focus mechanism doesn't work, that type of thing, all the way up to completely working models that are being sold by an enthusiast who's built the thing out and it has everything on it for $8,000, $10,000. So when you have a range that big, it is a little difficult sometimes to figure out if you're getting a good bargain. Though I would say if you get a research grade microscope, whether it works or not, for $200, you have got a good bargain. So there is that. Features that you may use as a macro photographer: objectives that are high powered, up to 100 times with oil immersion. Yeah, you may use it. I'm not sure they give great pictures unless you are very good at this. And there is a whole world of microscopy. There really is. I mean, you know how we macro photographers, with our gear, and there are just a million ways to do things. You've got all kinds of equipment. Everybody's got their own opinion, and we make tiny little tweaks to how we do things and get results that reflect that. It's exactly the same with microscopes. There's a whole world out there. I'm sure any microscopist who stumbled on this live stream has probably long since left, because this is awfully basic stuff. If you really want to go down the rabbit hole, then head over to photomicrography.net, and you will see that this esoterica doesn't even begin to cover the kind of machinations you'll go through talking to microscopists. It's very interesting though. Phase contrast like mine has, or DIC like Bud's microscope has. Yeah, they're expensive features, and if you find a microscope that has them on it, you may be able to get a better bargain, especially in an auction, than if you have to add it later. I read an article, had an article on my desk a minute ago that Rick Littlefield gave me. He's the guy that runs photomicrography.net, and he gave me an article last night, DIC, how much does it cost to add it to your microscope? And boy, that was an eye-opener. It's a lot. The prisms can be $1,000 a piece, and you need 9 of them if you have a Zeiss system. So yeah, it can get really expensive in a hurry. Built-in digital displays is something that come with the digital microscopes. They're a bit silly. I'm not sure I would be interested in that. The high-end Keonce microscopes I was telling you about, they come with a built-in television screen, but it's like a super high-end monitor, and yeah, if you've got $90,000, then I guess you could get a built-in digital display and it would be worth it. But if you ever get a chance, by the way, check out that company online and look at some of their microscopes. I tried to get them to lend me one, and they just laughed. They weren't having any of it. Gigantic, big, expensive things, but absolutely beautiful and so much fun to work with. There are some things that microscopes will add that are, again, they're beyond the scope of this general discussion. I think most dead serious macro photographers who are really into the cool stuff that we do at the extremes You could probably use both microscopes, but if you could only have one, I would get the practical, useful stereo microscope that will help you take better macro pictures. And yeah, the compound microscope may be something you put off. I put it off for decades. You know, I've had compound scopes in the past, but never a good one. And yeah, it's taken me decades of doing macro photography before I suddenly realized I needed one of these things. So I can't wait to get it. I'll have it on Saturday for the Zoom meeting, and we'll take a closer look at it, and I'll tell you if it works, and that type of thing. So let me see what kind of comments we have, if there's anybody still out there, and we'll see. In fact, I ought to check my Telegram first. Did I get the UV mercury lamp add-on with the diaphot? I think I did. I am not absolutely 100% certain, but it looks like it is mounted on the scope. I mentioned this the other day. In auctions, the people who list the thing often have no idea what they're listing. They got it right that it was a microscope, and they took a picture of it, but beyond that, they couldn't tell me anything about the objectives or anything. It was just what I could see from the pictures, so I don't know. Oh, Curious Scientist dropped in. I was just talking about you not a day ago, Curious. I'm so glad you're here. I was recommending to somebody that the person to go to if you wanted to learn electronics from a practical standpoint from a super smart guy with a great YouTube channel, check out Curious. Curious Scientist has his YouTube channel, and I will get I'll get one of the guys in the one of the bouncers, I should say, to list your website there on the your website and your channel in chat, so that people can go over and check it out. I learned everything that I know from a practical standpoint about using stepper motors and building circuits for controlling things, even about PID, from Curious. So I strongly recommend him. He knows exactly what he's talking about. Great channel. Fantastic. Let me see. There's been quite a bit of chat going on. Victor Multanen, super chat, $5. Thank you, sir. Thank you. That comes with a question. Did you ask a question? Hang on a second. There's a load of chit-chat been going on. Bud's here. Alistair's here as well. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for coming. Currently watching a Nikon 10 plan long working distance infinity on eBay. Currently at only £100. Sounds too good to be true. Looks in great condition. That was Alistair. What is it? The CFI Plan 10X? That's an Achromat, and you can actually buy that for £200 brand new. So that's probably not. Yeah, the CFI Plan 10X has a working distance of 10 millimeters, 10.5 millimeters. This might be a different one you're talking about, but they're both infinity corrected. They need a 200 millimeter tube lens. Yeah, I'm not sure. If you tell me which one it is, Alistair, I'll tell you if I know if that's a good price or not. David was saying in another live stream, you go on other live streams? I am hurt, man. That is terrible. Well, what do they say? It's not true anyway. The host can add the community conversation onto the video. I don't know what you mean by that, David. I thought the chat. Oh, you mean the chat's not on the video? I thought it was. I thought my videos had the chat with them. I'll look into that. Thanks for the pointer. I will check that out for sure. Nick, not something for Alan to deal with tonight, but okay, all right, fair enough. Nick, I got your message and heard it loud and clear, and on Saturday, that will come home to roost, and we'll talk about it. Thank you again to Victor for the super chat. Super Chat's where you give me money, by the way, guys. It's a handout, charity. I accept it graciously. Let me see. Iacobos Strikis Photography. That's like Alan Wall's photography, only with a slightly harder to pronounce name. Have you considered putting a diaphragm, a camera iris, between the Mitutoyo and the camera to help with scattered light and optical issues at high magnifications? Yes, I have, and I do. I actually have several irises. I scavenge them from all kinds of other optical garbage that I buy online or at wherever I find it, and yeah, I do. I have it mounted into a helicoid for that very purpose. I do use that, and it does work. In fact, I've talked about it in a couple of previous videos, so maybe it's time to chit-chat about it again. But thanks for the question. Let me see. Curious Scientists now posted his channel. Cannot tell you how useful that channel has been to me. Highly recommended. It is the CFI plan 10x 0.25 working distance 10.5 that Alistair's talking about. I wouldn't spend $100 on a used one. I wouldn't. I'd spend $200 on a brand new one, because you never know if it's been dropped and delaminated or anything like that. Then that you never know. With used microscope objectives are a scary proposition, and if it's anything less than half the price, I might consider it. But if it's if it's and the auction may go up from there. But yeah, you be the judge. It's right on the boundary there. But of course, if you don't have $200, then $100 is a much better deal. So yeah, I bought mine new, and I didn't have any money. I saved up for it, and I love it. I still use it. It is a fantastic microscope objective that, when used as a camera lens with a 200mm objective, 200mm tube lens, gives you a huge field of view, perfect for a full frame camera. And another thing about the 10x CFI plan, even though it's just an achromat, it is the sharpest 5x objective at with a 100mm tube lens. I use the Nikon 105. That does vignette a little bit, but my goodness, what a sharp picture in the center. So think about that. It is a good one to have. All right. There's been a lot of talk. I'm going to mention something that was mentioned to me today by a long-term supporter of the channel, and it is worth mentioning, though I don't plan on doing anything about it. It concerned the content of the chat. It's been some folks have pointed out that the chat can be all over the place, not necessarily what I'm talking about. I don't really mind. I don't have an issue about that. Some people feel like the chat could be more useful if it was focused on what I was talking about, but I'm not sure I agree. If you want to hear what I'm talking about, listen to what I'm talking about. I'll stay on point most of the time, and I'll cover the material I need to cover. The chat is really for you to explore and branch out. If you have something that's off topic, but it's interesting to the people around you, then I want you to talk about it. So I hear you. I hear the people who think that it should be more focused, but I also hear the rest of you who don't. And it's really none of my business what you guys chat about while you're watching my live stream. I don't mind what you talk about at all. So I apologize if your view is a bit different on that, but I'm not a big one for rules on stuff like this. I'd rather it be what you make it. These things are defined by you, the audience. If you don't like what somebody's saying, you tell them in the chat and they stop saying it, because I've seen you do it time and time again. You police yourselves. You don't need me to be big brothering that. And I don't want to do it anyway. I'm too busy. All right. I'm so glad everybody came. I'm sorry I really didn't get a time to say hi to Bud and Nick and Zeno and Bacon Meister and Anita. Anita, you have a question for me over in my Walls app, and I have not had a chance to get there to answer it. I am so sorry, but I'll go there now. I won't do anything else until I've gone over there and answered your question. I do apologize. And David's here. Curious was here, and we raved about his channel. Go over and check it out, please. And George, thanks for all your communications over the last couple of days, George. I really appreciate your help. Excellent. And yeah, if I missed anybody, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that. And Aya Kovos Strikis says, don't worry about the pronunciation of his name. It's all Greek to him. Well, it's all Greek to me too. He's Greek, of course, so there you go. All right, everybody, thank you so much. We're out of time completely, and this is awesome. I love to see all this chat and all these great ideas being exchanged, so keep it up. And yeah, next time I see you, I'll be peering through a new microscope. And I can't wait. We'll look at it on Tuesday, I'm sure, at some point. You want to see BrioCam 1 or BrioCam 2 again? Or how about split Brios? That's a bit confusing to look at, but I could set them up other ways. I think this is the one I like the best. All right, so there you go. You can watch me press the buttons to end the live stream now. Won't that be an unusual treat? Thank you to everybody for coming. I look forward to seeing all my Patreon folks on Saturday if you make it. Otherwise, I will see you on Tuesday at the next live stream. Take care, stay safe, and be well. Now I'm going to press the stop streaming button. You can't see it, but it's right there. And